She stood there, holding an old notebook on her lap, trying to hide her nervousness as she held a pen in her sweaty hands. Around the table, men in ties were talking loudly, toasting with expensive whiskey and laughing at jokes she didn't understand. When she tried to speak, one of them interrupted her without looking her in the eye. "Waitress, can you bring me some more ice? You're in the wrong place." She tried to explain that she was an intern, that she had been called to the meeting by mistake. But before she could finish her sentence, the CEO of the company, with his arrogance etched into his high chin, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Honey, you're invisible here. This world wasn't made for people like you." The laughter was automatic, but what no one imagined was that years later, when he walked into that same room, all the employees would stand up, and she would be at the head of the table. As CEO, the man who had once called her invisible had just lost his position, his influence, and silently his pride. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the board, under pressure, decided to do the unthinkable, hand over control to an outsider. But when he entered that room to hand over the key to the office, expecting to find an anonymous investor or some ruthless executive who would take his throne, he came face to face with her. The same girl with her hair tied back and shy eyes, now wearing a sober suit, confident, firm, without needing to say anything. All the employees, including those who had previously laughed at her, stood up in respect. She walked towards him with silent steps and simply extended her hand. Not for revenge, but for justice. And in that moment, he knew. She had always been above. She was just invisible to the wrong eyes. And if this turn of events has already given you goosebumps, imagine what's yet to come. Like now and subscribe to the channel, because what she will do next will leave you speechless. Follow me. The 38th floor conference room at Northwell Enterprises was a sanctuary of expensive silence. The air conditioning blew a chilly tone, and the floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an opulent view of Manhattan. Black leather chairs swiveled lazily as the executives settled into their seats, each with his Swiss watch and leather briefcases, while words flew between jargon and unattainable goals. In the center, a long, gleaming table reflected the cool, overhead lights. It was annual review day, and CEO Jonathan Ashford had called all the department heads together to discuss cuts, expansion, and new contracts. At the head of the table, his voice was law, and his gaze a sentence. When the elevator opened and she stepped in hesitantly, clutching a blue notebook to her chest, their eyes turned almost in unison, with the same automatic indifference one might have when observing a cleaning lady at the wrong time. She took a deep breath. It was her first day as an intern in the analytics department, and a system error had included her name among the meeting attendees. Instead of turning back, she plucked up the courage and went upstairs. She thought maybe they would let her watch, learn, observe. She was hungry for the future, even if she didn't have the right suit or fancy shoes. One of the managers cleared his throat as she approached an empty chair. "The breakout room is on the 17th floor, he murmured, not even looking at her. Before she could answer, Jonathan looked up from his report and stared at her. His gaze was sharp, accustomed to controlling, measuring, judging. She tried to explain the misunderstanding, but he raised his hand as if to order silence. "You're invisible here," he said without emotion, as if he had said the coffee was cold. "Waitresses and interns don't participate in decision-making meetings. This world is for prepared people. Here, appearance matters." The words were not shouted, but they were heard by everyone, and the muffled laughter of two analysts completed the sentence. She froze for a moment, smiled embarrassedly, thanked him, and left. There were no tears in her eyes, only a strange peace, as if that humiliation had planted a seed. Outside, the hallway was warmer. The silence was different. When she stepped into the elevator, she looked at her own reflection in the steel door and let out the breath that had been trapped in her chest. She felt ashamed, yes, but she also felt something emerging, an idea that she herself could not yet name. Deep down, I already knew. This was not the end, it was the beginning. Her name was Evelyn Grace Miller, and despite the sweetness of the name, her childhood was far from light. She grew up in a forgotten part of Newark, where sirens replaced the sound of crickets at night, and neighbors changed doors more often than there were months on the calendar. Her mother, Brenda, was a janitor at a public hospital. She worked the night shift and slept all day, if at all. Her father, he was never mentioned. The only photo Evelyn knew of him was a blurry image of a shirtless man holding a beer at a barbecue decades ago. It was gone when she was still a toddler. From an early age, Evelyn learned not to ask for anything. Not for food, not for attention, not for affection. She knew that everything had a cost, and most of the time she couldn't afford it. She studied in public schools where teachers gave up on students before the second semester and often did her homework by the light of a street lamp, because the electricity bill was late. Still she dreamed, not of castles or princes, but of a quiet room, with books organized by subject, with working air conditioning and a leisurely cup of tea. She was an oddity to her peers. She didn't swear, she didn't fight for territory, and she seemed happy to spend hours drawing graphs in a recycled notebook. Some laughed at her, others simply ignored her. But she didn't care. She treasured every small victory, a pencil from the library, a compliment from a substitute teacher, an acceptance letter to a state program for low-income students. That's how she got to Columbia University on a full scholarship. She came in through the side door, through social exclusion, but she didn't let it define her. She worked serving coffee on the weekends, took care of an elderly woman on Monday nights, and studied until her body begged for rest. Her notebooks were organized as if they were written for someone important. Clean graphs. Notes in different colors. Ideas connected by arrows. Evelyn didn't study to get good grades. She studied because she wanted to understand the world, to know how money, power, and decisions worked. She wanted to learn the language of those who gave orders, even though they had called her invisible all her life. She just didn't imagine that one day she would meet one of them face to face, and that he would leave a scar in the form of an opportunity. But everything has its time, and in that silent cycle between empty libraries and dark corridors, Evelyn was shaping herself, without shouting, without showing off, just planting. She believed that life would return sooner or later, everything that was done in silence. 3 weeks after the incident in the conference room, Evelyn was still an intern in the analytics department, but now she was stationed in the basement, in a makeshift room between two noisy servers. There she typed spreadsheets, organized forgotten data, and fed systems that no one cared to understand. And it was during one of those silent nights, when she stayed after hours to study the company's internal reports, that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. She wasn't eavesdropping. She had simply entered the coffee room to get a cup when she heard Jonathan and two managers laughing down the hall. "That girl from the meeting," one of them said. "The ghost intern?" "That's it. The invisible one," Jonathan added with a half-smile. "I bet Ross that she won't last more than a month here. Look at the way she dresses. She has hungry eyes but the soul of a common person. She'll give up." "What if I don't give up?" "Then you owe me dinner in Paris. But trust me, this world breaks people like her before the second round." The laughter was dry and sharp. Evelyn stood still behind the door, feeling the porcelain cup warm in her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't react. She just went back to her desk, turned on her computer, and began to write harder. On the screen, she opened a report on the company's investment failures over the past 5 years. It was something she had been mapping out of curiosity. But now, it was personal. Not because of the bet itself, but because of the tone of certainty. The way he spoke of her as if she were just a pause in his life, as if she were a disposable comma in his narrative of power. That same night, she did something unthinkable. She printed out the 17-page report, bound it in a transparent cover, and left it on the desk of one of the directors. No name, no signature, just data, graphs, and forecasts. The next day, the company hallways were buzzing with activity. Something about inconsistencies in old contracts and a financial hole that no one had noticed. Evelyn just watched from afar, pushing the file cart. Jonathan passed her twice that day. He didn't recognize her. And that's when Evelyn understood the true value of being invisible. When no one expects anything from Everything you do seems impossible, and when your steps are not seen, no one notices the path being built. The world he believed he controlled was made of appearances. What it carried was substance, but the game was far from over. The bet had been made, but he never imagined that he would lose much more than a dinner. It was on a cloudy Tuesday that Evelyn crossed paths with Jonathan again, this time under more intimate circumstances. The corridor on the 30th floor was empty, except for a security guard dozing in the corner and the muffled sound of footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She had been called to deliver an urgent financial analysis that the directors requested for the 10 o'clock meeting. The recommendation had come from the department head himself, who, unaware of their past history, recognized her efficiency in putting together accurate reports. Evelyn went upstairs with her briefcase in hand, discreetly, wearing a starched white shirt and her hair tied tightly. When she reached the door, she heard her name being called by a firm and familiar voice. "Evelyn, right?" Jonathan looked at her with narrowed eyes, as if trying to fit her into some incomplete memory. "Who sent you here?" "Mr. Darrow requested it. He asked me to deliver this personally." She kept her voice neutral without a tremor, no trace of what she carried inside. He took the folder from her hands without thanking her, flipping it open and flipping through it quickly. The charts were clear, the numbers aligned, and the reasoning flowed like that of a senior consultant. Jonathan frowned. "You did this?" "Yes, sir." "Where do you study?" "Columbia, scholarship holder." He nodded once, closed the folder, and said simply, "Don't let that ambition fool you. Some doors open only to close harder later." And then he turned away, ending the moment. She didn't answer or smile. She just watched as he walked into the conference room, carrying the analysis she'd spent nights putting together, while she divided her attention between formulas and caring for a sick woman in the apartment next door. It wasn't anger she felt. It was awareness. He was beginning to realize that maybe she wasn't just a mistake on the agenda. But he didn't understand enough yet. He still thought he could label, predict, dominate. Days later, Jonathan called her again, this time with a more objective tone. He needed her to help with a presentation. Evelyn knew it was a pretext. He wanted her. Information, but not the credit. She accepted. And she worked with the same excellence as always, even knowing that she would not be mentioned. She understood that some men would rather die ignorant than admit that they had been helped by someone they had despised. However, with each contact, something changed. He began to observe her more, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with discomfort. Evelyn, in turn, kept her distance. She knew that real respect is not something you ask for. It is earned, but not with force, with presence. And she, without even knowing it, was already beginning to inhabit the spaces where he least expected it. It was the end of the quarter, and Northwell Enterprises was holding an internal event called Golden Circle, where top executives presented impactful projects and selected promising young people to accompany the directors on future initiatives. For Evelyn, it was yet another opportunity to learn. She wasn't looking for a stage, just the chance to watch. She quietly prepared a proposal, an internal investment optimization system that could save millions in poorly informed decisions. She submitted it humbly. She didn't expect a response. On the morning of the event, she received a vague email. "Attend presentation 3B, 10 a.m. She assumed it was to help with some technical function. She put on her best blue shirt and tied her hair in a discreet bow. When she arrived at the auditorium, she noticed the looks on everyone's faces. Some were mocking. Others were confused. No one had expected her to be there. Jonathan, positioned in the center of the audience next to the board, saw her enter and whispered something in the ear of the man next to her. They laughed quietly. She approached the organizing team and asked if she should hand in anything. One of the assistants looked at the list and frowned. "Evelyn Miller, you're not among the presenters." "I got this call," he said, showing the email. The man called another person in, Charge, who after a few seconds muttered, "It must have been a mistake. That email was for another department. You weren't supposed to be here." She stood in the middle of the hallway. Everyone was watching. The projector was on, the panel with the names of the projects lit up, but hers wasn't there. Jonathan looked at her like someone watching a predictable show. Waitress in the boardroom. A project that doesn't exist. He said, loud enough to be heard. Will it become a habit, miss? Miller? Some laughed. Others pretended not to hear. She swallowed hard, thanked him with a restrained nod, and left. She walked to the bathroom on the lower floor, entered the last stall, and there, yes, the tears came. But they weren't from pain. They were from exhaustion, from the tiredness of always needing to prove that she exists, that she deserves to be where she stands, that she isn't a mistake in the system. That very day, she made a decision. She would no longer feed that system with her hopes. She would return to her work in silence, but now with a new purpose, to build something he could not see, predict, or control. And if his world was made of spotlights, she would choose the shadows, because that was where the deepest roots were formed. The following days were the quietest of Evelyn's career at Northwell, silent on the outside, because on the inside a storm was brewing. She continued working underground, updating reports, cross-referencing data from sectors that no one else cared to look at. But now something was different. She no longer had doubts. Jonathan's voice echoing in that auditorium, the humiliation, the muffled laughter. Everything had been the final push. Evelyn knew she didn't need permission to exist, and even less validation from those who underestimated her. It was on a Friday afternoon that he called her again. The company was facing a strange decline in one of the investment funds, and the legal department had received alerts that no one could decipher. Jonathan was irritated. The risk director suggested that Evelyn be heard, since her reports had been quietly attracting attention. Reluctantly, he agreed. He sent for the girl with the charts. When she entered the room, she found 3 directors, 2 lawyers, and Jonathan frowning. "Do you have any idea what's going on with the Epsilon Fund?" he asked, not looking directly at her. Evelyn nodded. She opened her folder and pulled out a sheet of data cross-references that she had put together on her own, without anyone asking. 5 months ago, a supplier was included without bidding in 2 simultaneous contracts. The payments came from separate accounts to disguise the tracking. I identified the flows and traced a pattern. The diversion is linked to the Epsilon Fund. It's here. The room fell silent. Jonathan took the paper, leafed through it, read the numbers, the names, the arrows she had drawn by hand. "And how did you find out about that?" She then took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes for the first time since that day. Because when no one expects anything from someone, that person sees what others don't see. Because when you called me invisible, you gave me the best disguise possible. The room froze. A director coughed, disconcerted. Jonathan stared at Evelyn with something that was neither anger nor shame. It was bewilderment. For once, he had no words ready. Then she continued firmly, "I also heard the conversation in the hallway. About the bet. About the dinner in Paris. I didn't mind. Because while you were betting on my failure, I was building my permanence. And now, with all due respect, either you fix this, or this scandal will cost you more than just bruised egos." She picked up the sheet, handed a copy to the principal, and left. She didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice. But she left behind a sound that none of them could silence, the sound of someone who knew, and chose to wait for the right moment to be heard. The following Monday, Jonathan arrived at the company earlier than usual. He had spent the weekend in silence, something unusual for someone who was used to surrounding himself with busy schedules and unavoidable commitments. But there was something about this girl that disconcerted him. Evelyn. Her name was now echoed in meetings, mentioned in directors' emails, and even by the chairman of the board, who praised her operational clarity in one of the most sensitive reviews of the quarter. Jonathan felt an uneasiness he couldn't name, an uneasiness that went beyond wounded arrogance. It was as if he had missed something and was only now realizing it. He decided to look for her in the internal records. You logged in and typed in your name. Evelyn Grace Miller, Columbia Scholar. Impeccable passage through 3 excellent social programs. Fatherless, raised by a single mother in Newark, only failed once, for excessive absences. The year her mother was hospitalized for 6 months with kidney failure. Jonathan read each line as if discovering a book he should have read long ago. And then, in a forgotten tab of an HR report, he found something that made him freeze. There was an old social program called Minds of Tomorrow, sponsored years before by Northwell itself, in a public gesture of social responsibility that it had signed, only for marketing purposes. Evelyn was one of the 5 sponsored children. Her mother cleaned bathrooms in the building that was the company's old headquarters. Jonathan, then vice president at the time, once passed Brenda Miller in a hallway when she was crying, afraid of being fired for not being able to make it to the night shift. He had authorized them to keep her job for another month, a small bureaucratic gesture, but enough for the woman to say years later to her daughter, "Even if he doesn't know it, it was this man who allowed me to keep cleaning floors. That's why you're going to school." Jonathan closed the report and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years he felt small. The girl he had tried to erase, ridicule, bet against, was the daughter of the cleaning lady he had almost sent away without thinking twice. She had been there forever, growing up in the hallways he had never seen, silently watching the workings of everything he thought he controlled. And now she was shaping, with her own hands, a new reality within the same company. That was no coincidence. It was a cycle. It was justice drawn in silence. And for the first time Jonathan understood the value of a name repeated for years within a simple house, in voices of faith and sacrifice. Evelyn Miller was not just a brilliant intern, she was the seed that had germinated in the ground he himself had stepped on without looking. On Wednesday, Evelyn didn't show up, not in the basement, not in the hallways. There was no email alert, no sign-in on her badge. The risk director discreetly asked a colleague in the analysis department if she was sick. The young man just shrugged. She turned everything in early. She must be working on something personal. But Jonathan knew better. Something inside him, almost like a sixth sense, told him that her absence was not casual. It was a strategic withdrawal, as if Evelyn had decided to leave not out of necessity, but out of choice, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Days passed. Meetings began to accumulate inaccurate data. Analysis was disorganized even when entire teams were responsible for it. Something was missing, a kind of clarity that Evelyn brought without making a fuss. Jonathan realized that he had grown accustomed to consulting her reports, even when he didn't admit it. He began searching for files signed by her. He sifted through old spreadsheets, finding marks he had previously ignored, little notes next to the numbers, like whispers from someone who saw beyond the obvious. It was like rereading a book and discovering meanings that had gone unnoticed. On Friday, he went to the HR department and informally asked about the intern. The answer came back dry. Miss Miller requested to leave the internship program. She said she needed to take care of her mother's health. Jonathan didn't answer. He just nodded and left in silence. He went back to the office and, on impulse, accessed his email. No message from her. No goodbye. No explanation. Just emptiness. And it was this emptiness that hurt the most. Not because he admired her, he still didn't know exactly what he felt, but because he was used to controlling everything and everyone. And Evelyn had simply disappeared, as if she had taken her name out of the game and left only the echo of her own absence. On Sunday night, alone in his minimalist apartment, Jonathan opened a bottle of wine. He sat in front of the large windows and looked out at the city lights. He thought about all the people he had underestimated in his life, the faces he had ignored, the voices he had cut in half. He thought about Evelyn's steady gaze when she had said, "You gave me the best disguise." It played in his mind like a silent refrain. For the first time, he missed not someone who had complimented him, but someone who had challenged him intelligently, and unexpectedly, he realized that there was something about her that no one else in that company had. Purpose, not status, not name, not inherited wealth. Purpose, and purpose, he was beginning to understand, was more valuable than power. The first headlines appeared discreetly, like whispers on specialized portals. Northwell Enterprises under investigation for failures in public contracts. Then came the compliance alerts, the extraordinary audits, the cancelled interview invitations. the uncomfortable looks in the hallways. Jonathan was still the CEO on paper, but inside he could already feel the ground giving way. The scandal involving the Epsilon Fund had grown like a poorly diagnosed tumor. What had previously been a technical error now took on tones of mismanagement, recklessness, and ethical negligence. He tried to maintain control, but the media and the market are voracious creatures. They smell weakness. At an extraordinary meeting with the board, he was pressed with questions about the ignored reports, the ignored internal alerts, the decisions made without consultation. Jonathan, who for years had reigned with ready-made phrases and an impenetrable posture, now felt his throat dry. With each question, he remembered the sheets that Evelyn had left with precise graphs, the handwritten notes, the observations that he pretended not to see. What had previously been arrogance now revealed itself as short-sightedness, and the price of blindness was high. The final blow came via email. One of the company's main investors announced that he was withdrawing his stake. The statement was short and cruel. Lack of confidence in the current management. The stock plummeted. Employees began to talk. In the hallways, that intern knew all about this, right? The girl who wrote the reports disappeared just when everything turned upside down. And soon, Evelyn's name began to circulate with a new meaning. No longer as the young woman who dared to go up without being called, but as the one who saw what no one wanted to see. Jonathan began to be avoided even by his own allies. The forced smiles disappeared. Greetings became quick and empty. In the elevators, the silence was absolute. He felt the looks of judgment, pity, and relief. After all, for many, his downfall was also a chance for ascension. It was the price one paid for reigning alone, without sincere allies, without real human connections. The loneliness of the top was now turning into internal exile. One rainy night, sitting in his nearly empty office, Jonathan stared at the dark reflection in the window. The phone rang. It was the chairman of the board. Straightforward, no nonsense. "We are terminating your tenure. The new board will be announced shortly. You will receive the terms by email." And so, without ceremony, his reign ended. No round of applause, no official statement of praise, just a quiet, silent departure. Just as he had treated so many over the years. And in the midst of that emptiness, the name that echoed in her mind was no longer that of the company. It was hers, Evelyn. In the weeks since his dismissal, Jonathan Ashford has experienced a new sensation. Real silence. Not the comfortable silence of a respected boardroom, but the cold silence of a house too big for one man. His cell phone, which had been buzzing every few minutes with calls, notifications, and last-minute meetings, now rested motionless on the kitchen table. The marble walls, the modern paintings, the imported armchairs, they all seemed to echo the same question he was trying to avoid. Who am I without my job? Without the uniform of power, without a title, without the forced smiles around him, Jonathan found himself stripped of the layers he had worn for decades to disguise his own fragility. He began to wake up earlier, not out of obligation, but because of insomnia. He would go to the coffee shop on the corner, the same one he had never gone to before because he preferred the executive coffees in five-star hotels. There, sitting at modest tables, he watched the city breathe, as if he were seeing the world for the first time without the filters of privilege. He went back to reading. Books that Evelyn had mentioned in a presentation that he had barely paid attention to. He bought them all. He highlighted passages. He wrote reflections in the margins. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a page and close his eyes, trying to remember if at any point in his career he had looked into someone's eyes with genuine interest. He couldn't remember. All he remembered were goals, numbers, bonuses, status. Now, all of that seemed distant to him, irrelevant. One rainy afternoon, he visited the old Northwell headquarters, the building where years ago he had ignored Evelyn's mother, Brenda Miller. He walked into the lobby like any other citizen. No security guard recognized him. He sat on a bench in the hallway and sat there for hours. I watched the cleaning ladies, the interns, the delivery men, people who had previously been invisible to him. And there, in that raw simplicity, he understood what Evelyn had meant by the best possible disguise. He understood the power of being ignored, the weight of being seen only when it suits him. He began visiting community centers, not to be applauded but to listen. He met single mothers, young dreamers, and elderly people forgotten by the system that he himself had helped to strengthen with his indifference. Little by little, he began to rebuild something within himself. Not a career plan, but an idea of a man who could finally listen before ordering, look before judging, serve before being served. Evelyn didn't answer his emails. She didn't need to. Her absence was presence enough. Her silence was voice. And now Jonathan was finally learning the language of those who live in the shadows and yet shine a light on others. It was on a grey autumn morning, one of those when the wind seems to carry something that goes far beyond the cold, that Jonathan saw his name discreetly printed at the bottom of an electronic invitation: Corporate Ethics Council, Inaugural Lecture, Human Leadership, and the New Paths of Governance. The event would take place at the new Innovation Center of the former Northwell, now remodeled after the change in leadership. The main name of the opening? Evelyn Grace Miller. He hesitated. He didn't answer right away. But that night, alone in the apartment that now seemed even bigger, he read the invitation again, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that he didn't need to show up to be seen. He just needed to listen. He confirmed his presence. And on the day of the event, he arrived early and sat discreetly in the fourth row next to teachers, counselors, and young students. When she entered the stage, the room fell silent. She was different, but the same. She had the same serene posture, attentive eyes, the silent firmness of someone who has learned to take a deep breath before making any response. She wore a dark grey blazer, her hair tied up simply, her voice firm, confident, and each sentence she said seemed to speak louder than the words themselves. She spoke about decisions, about listening, about power as a responsibility and not as a shield. And at a certain point, without naming names, she said, "Often, the place that despises us is the same place that teaches us. Sometimes the door that closes is not a punishment, but a warning from heaven. You deserve something greater. And if you survived contempt, perhaps it was precisely to understand the value of seeing the other." Jonathan didn't look away. Every sentence seemed to be stuck, right in his face, even though she didn't look at him once. When the lecture ended, the audience gave a standing ovation. She thanked him with a slight smile and walked down the stairs with calm steps. And for a moment, her eyes met his. There was no anger, no indifference. There was something he couldn't decipher. Maybe respect, maybe mercy. Later, at the cocktail party, he approached her slowly, as if entering sacred territory. She was alone, looking at a display of photographs honoring former employees of the company, including her mother. Jonathan cleared his throat and she turned her face away calmly. "Evelyn, Jonathan, I didn't come to seek forgiveness or explanations. I just needed to hear you, to know that you'd arrived." She nodded slightly. "I didn't arrive, Jonathan. I just kept walking even when they said it wasn't worth it. You taught me that, without knowing it." He smiled with his eyes downcast. "I hope it's different now." She took a deep breath, watched him. For a long second. "We are always changing, but some lessons need silence to work." And then, before he could say another word, she walked toward a group of young people waiting for her with notebooks and shining eyes. Jonathan stood there, understanding that the reunion was not a bridge to the past. It was confirmation that he was finally out of her story, but never out of her learning. Days after that reunion, Evelyn received an unexpected message in her email. It was short, straightforward, written with a care that revealed hesitation. Jonathan thanked her for the talk, said he had listened to every word as if listening to a mirror, and ended with a direct request. "Can we have a coffee? No past, no protocol, just a coffee." Evelyn read the message once, then again. She didn't respond. Not out of contempt, but because she now knew that silence sometimes said more. But that Friday, as she left the office at dusk, She saw her mother sitting on the bench in the foundation's garden, holding one of the photos that had been placed in her honor. Brenda Miller was frailer, but she smiled with the firm eyes of someone who had survived many things without ever losing faith. "Did he look for you?" he asked simply, without mentioning names. Evelyn just nodded. Sometimes those who hurt us also carry their own pain in silence. Sometimes there is no need for revenge, just distance. Evelyn smiled, kissed her mother on the forehead, and at that very moment decided that yes, she would reply to the message. Not for him, for you. She arranged to meet at a small cafe, far from the tall buildings and the city of ties. When Jonathan arrived, he was dressed simply. He had cut his hair, was carrying only an envelope, and had a more tired look, or perhaps a more humble look. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting down across from her cautiously, as if treading on someone else's ground. Evelyn just watched. "I know I don't deserve your time, or your words, but if there's something I can do to give you back some of the dignity I stole—" She interrupted him with a light gesture of her hand. "You didn't steal my dignity, Jonathan. It was never at stake. You tried to diminish me, yes. You tried to erase me, but all you gave me was a boost, and that changed me." He was silent. Then he took a deep breath and handed over the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Jonathan recounted with brutal honesty his history of arrogance, his mistakes, his fears, and, at the end, a substantial donation signed in the name of Evelyn's mother, directed to the scholarship fund for young people from poor communities. "I'm not trying to clean up the past," he said. "I'm just trying not to repeat the same silences that built me." Evelyn read it calmly. She folded the letter, and she replied softly, "I don't need you to ask me for forgiveness, because I already forgave you the day you laughed at me. That's when I understood that I wasn't you, and that was liberating." He nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. But before he could say anything else, Evelyn stood up. She paid for the coffee, thanked him with a slight smile, and simply said, "I'm glad you're here, Jonathan. Now move on. But this time, look at the people." She turned and left without looking back, because her decision had already been made. Forgiveness she had given, but goodbye. That was the quietest gift she could offer. At the company's new headquarters, the main hall was brighter than before. The glass walls let in the sunlight without barriers, and the hallways were as quiet as libraries. There were fresh plants in the corners, paintings by young people from the local suburbs, and right at the entrance, a discreet plaque with the name of the new leadership. The employees chatted with light respect without tension. Some wore jeans, others wore suits. Everyone sat down, waiting for the first general meeting of the quarter. Then the door opened. Evelyn Ontro. He didn't say a word. She walked with a steady, composed stride, holding a blue folder under her arm, the same one she had had years ago. Behind her, two young analysts carried laptops. As she crossed the dark carpet and approached the long conference table one by one, the employees stood up, silently, all of them. No instructions, no commands, just respect. At the end of the room, an empty seat awaited her. She stopped for a moment, looked around. The faces were new, but the eyes carried something. She knew well. Hope. The same hope that she had once had to hide in her pocket. He sat down calmly. He opened the folder. He closed his eyes for a brief second, and then he smiled. "If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to something inside you, so comment below. I was once invisible too, but I didn't give up. This shows that you felt every detail of this journey. Take advantage and leave a like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because there are a lot of stories like this coming. And now don't leave without watching the video that's appearing on the screen. It's another true story, with twists and turns, silent justice and excitement until the end. Click now and let the next chapter touch your heart.